Chapter 7: A Tragi-Comedy in a Cab. In front of Donaldson's hospital, John counted it good fortune to perceive a cab a great way off, and by much shouting and waving of his arm to catch the notice of the driver, he counted it good fortune. For the time was long to him till he should have done for ever with the lodge, and the further he must go to find a cab, the greater the chance that the inevitable discovery had taken place, and that he should return to find the garden full of angry neighbours. Yet when the vehicle drew up he was sensibly chagrined to recognise the port wine cabman of the night before. Here he could not but reflect, here is another link in the judicial error. The driver, on the other hand, was pleased to drop again upon so liberal a fare, and as he was a man the reader must already have perceived of easy, not to say familiar, manners, he dropped at once into a vein of friendly talk, commenting on the weather, on the sacred season, which struck him chiefly in the light of a day of liberal gratuities, on the chance which had reunited him to a pleasing customer, and on the fact that John had been, as he was pleased to call it, visibly on the random the night before. "And ye look dreadful bad the day, sir. I must say that," he continued. "There's nothing like a dram for ye if you'll take my advice of it, and being as it's Christmas, I'm no saying," he added, with a fatherly smile, "but what I would join ye mysel." John had listened with a sick heart. "I'll give you a dram when we've got through," said he, affecting a sprightliness which sat on him most unhandsomely, and not a drop till then. Business first and pleasure afterward. With this promise the jarvey was prevailed upon to clamber to his place and drive, with hideous deliberation. To the door of the lodge there were no signs as yet of any public emotion. Only two men stood not far off in talk, and their presence, seen from afar, set John's pulses buzzing. He might have spared himself his fright, for the pair were lost in some dispute of a theological complexion, and with lengthened upper lip and enumerating fingers, pursued the matter of their difference, and paid no heed to John. But the cabman proved a thorn in the flesh. Nothing would keep him on his perch. He must clamber down, comment upon the pebble in the door which he regarded as an ingenious but unsafe device, help John with the portmanteau, and enliven matters with a flow of speech, and especially of questions, which I thus condense. "He'll no be here himsel, will he? No? Well, he's an eccentric man, a fair oddity, if ye ken the expression. Great trouble with his tenants, they tell me. I've driven the family for years. I drove a cab at his father's wedding. What'll your name be? I should ken your face. Beggarey, ye say? There were beggaries about Gilmerton. You'll be one of that lot. Then this'll be a friend's portmanteau like. Why? Because the name upon it's Nicholson. Oh, if you're in a hurry. That's another job. Waverley Brig. Are ye for away?" So the friendly toper prated and questioned, and kept John's heart in a flutter. But to this also, as to other evils under the sun, there came a period, and the victim of circumstances began at last to rumble toward the railway terminus at Waverley Bridge. During the transit, he sat with raised glasses in the frosty chill and moody fetor of chariot, and glanced out sidelong on the holiday face of things, the shuttered shops, and the crowds along the pavement, much as the rider in the Tyburn cart may have observed the concourse gathering to his execution. At the station his spirits rose again. Another stage of his escape was fortunately ended. He began to spy blue water. He called a railway porter, and bade him carry the portmanteau to the cloakroom. Not that he had any notion of delay, flight. Instant flight was his design, no matter whither. But he had determined to dismiss the cabman ere he named, or even chose, his destination, thus possibly balking the judicial error of another link. This was his cunning aim, and now with one foot on the roadway, and one still on the coach step, he made haste to put the thing in practice, and plunged his hand into his trousers pocket. There was nothing there. Was nothing there. Oh yes, this time he was to blame. He should have remembered, and when he deserted his blood-stained pantaloons, he should not have deserted along with them his purse. Make the most of his error, and then compare it with the punishment. Conceive his new position, for I lack words to picture it. Conceive him condemned to return to that house, from the very thought of which his soul revolted, and once more to expose himself to capture on the very scene of the misdeed. Conceive him linked to the mouldy cab and the familiar cabman. John cursed the cabman silently, and then it occurred to him that he must stop the incarceration of his portmanteau. That, at least, he must keep close at hand, and he turned to recall the porter. But his reflections, brief as they had appeared, must have occupied him longer than he supposed, and there was the man already returning with the receipt. Well, that was settled. He had lost his portmanteau also, for the sixpence with which he had paid the Murrayfield toll was one that had strayed alone into his waistcoat pocket, and unless he once more successfully achieved the adventure of the house of crime, his portmanteau lay in the cloakroom in eternal pawn, for lack of a penny fee. And then he remembered the porter, who stood suggestively attentive, words of gratitude hanging on his lips. John hunted right and left. He found a coin, prayed God that it was a sovereign, drew it out, beheld a halfpenny, and offered it to the porter. The man's jaw dropped. "It's only a halfpenny," he said, startled out of railway decency. "I know that," said John, piteously. And here the porter recovered the dignity of man. "Thank you, sir," said he, and would have returned the base gratuity. But John, too, would none of it, and as they struggled, who must join in but the cabman? "Hoots, Mr. Bagre," said he, "you surely forget what day it is." "I tell you I have no change," cried John. "Well," said the driver, "and what then? I would rather give a man a shilling on a day like this than put him off with a derision like a bawbee. I'm surprised at the like of you, Mr. Bagre." "My name is not Bagre," broke out John, in mere childish temper and distress. "You told me it was yourself," said the cabman. "I know I did. And what the devil right had you to ask?" cried the unhappy one. "Oh, very well," said the driver. "I know my place. If you know yours, he repeated, as one who should imply grave doubt, and muttered inarticulate thunders, in which the grand old name of gentleman was taken seemingly in vain. Oh, to have been able to discharge this monster, whom John now perceived, with tardy clear-sightedness, to have begun betimes the festivities of Christmas. But far from any such ray of consolation visiting the lost, he stood bare of help and helpers, his portmanteau sequestered in one place, his money deserted in another, and guarded by a corpse himself so sedulous of privacy, the cynosure of all men's eyes about the station. And, as if these were not enough mischances, he was now fallen ill blood with the beast to whom his poverty had linked him, in ill blood, as he reflected dismally, with the witness who perhaps might hang or save him. There was no time to be lost. He durst not linger any longer in that public spot, and whether he had recourse to dignity or conciliation, the remedy must be applied at once. Some happily surviving element of manhood moved him to the former. "Let us have no more of this," said he, his foot once more upon the step. "Go back to where we came from." He had avoided the name of any destination, for there was now quite a little band of railway folk about the cab, and he still kept an eye upon the court of justice, and laboured to avoid concentric evidence. But here again the fatal Jarvey outmanoeuvred him. "Back to the lodge," cried he, in shrill tones of protest. "Drive on at once," roared John, and slammed the door behind him, so that the crazy chariot rocked and jingled. Forth trundled the cab into the Christmas streets, the fair within plunged in the blackness of a despair that neighboured on unconsciousness, the driver on the box digesting his rebuke and his customer's duplicity. I would not be thought to put the pair in competition. John's case was out of all parallel. But the cabman, too, is worth the sympathy of the judicious, for he was a fellow of genuine kindliness and a high sense of personal dignity incensed by drink, and his advances had been cruelly and publicly rebuffed. As he drove, therefore, he counted his wrongs, and thirsted for sympathy and drink. Now, it chanced he had a friend, a publican in Queensferry Street, from whom, in view of the sacredness of the occasion, he thought he might extract a dram. Queensferry Street lies something off the direct road to Murrayfield. But then there is the hilly cross-road that passes by the valley of the Leith in the Dean Cemetery, and Queensferry Street is on the way to that. What was to hinder the cabman, since his horse was dumb, from choosing the cross-road, and calling on his friend in passing? So it was decided, and the charioteer, already somewhat mollified, turned aside his horse to the right. John, meanwhile, sat collapsed, his chin sunk upon his chest, his mind in abeyance. The smell of the cab was still faintly present to his senses, and a certain leaden chill about his feet. All else had disappeared in one vast oppression of calamity and physical faintness. It was drawing on to noon, 22 hours since he had broken bread. In the interval, he had suffered tortures of sorrow and alarm, and been partly tipsy. And though it was impossible to say he slept, yet when the cab stopped and the cabman thrust his head into the window, his attention had to be recalled from depths of vacancy. "If you'll no stand me a dram," said the driver, with a well-merited severity of tone and manner, "I dare say you'll have no objection to my taking one myself." "Yes, no, do what you like," returned John. And then, as he watched his tormentor mount the stairs and enter the whisky shop, there floated into his mind a sense as of something long ago familiar. At that he started fully awake, and stared at the shop fronts. Yes, he knew them, but when? And how? Long since, he thought, and then, casting his eye through the front glass, which had been recently occluded by the figure of the Jarvey, he beheld the tree-tops of the Rookery in Randolph Crescent. He was close to home, where he had thought, at that hour, to be sitting in the well-remembered drawing-room in friendly converse. And, instead, it was his first impulse to drop into the bottom of the cab, his next, to cover his face with his hands. So he sat, while the cabman toasted the publican, and the publican toasted the cabman, and both reviewed the affairs of the nation. So he still sat, when his master condescended to return, and drive off at last downhill, along the curve of Linderdock Place. But even so, sitting, as he passed the end of his father's street, he took one glance from between shielding fingers, and beheld a doctor's carriage at the door. Well, just so, thought he, I'll have killed my father. And this is Christmas Day! If Mr. Nicholson died, it was down this same road he must journey to the grave, and down this road, on the same errand, his wife had preceded him years before, and many other leading citizens, with the proper trappings and attendants of the end. And now, in that frosty, ill-smelling, straw carpeted, and ragged cushioned cab with his breath congealing on the glasses. Where else was John himself advancing to? The thought stirred his imagination, which began to manufacture many thousand pictures, bright and fleeting, like the shapes in a kaleidoscope, and now he saw himself, ruddy and comforted, sliding in the gutter. And again, a little woe-begone, bored urchin tricked forth in crepe and weepers, descending this same hill at the foot's pace of mourning coaches, his mother's body just preceding him. And yet again, his fancy, running far in front, showed him his destination now standing solitary in the low sunshine, with the sparrows hopping on the threshold, and the dead man within staring at the roof. And now, with a sudden change, thronged about with white-faced, hand-uplifting neighbors, and doctor bursting through their midst and fixing his stethoscope as he went, the policeman shaking a sagacious head beside the body. It was to this he feared that he was driving. In the midst of this he saw himself arrive, heard himself stammer faint explanations, and felt the hand of the constable upon his shoulder. Heavens, how he wished he had played the manlier part, how he despised himself that he had fled that fatal neighborhood when all was quiet, and should now be tamely traveling back when it was thronging with avengers. Any strong degree of passion lends, even to the dullest, the forces of the imagination. And so now, as he dwelt on what was probably awaiting him at the end of this distressful drive, John, who saw things little, remembered them less, and could not have described them at all, beheld in his mind's eye the garden of the lodge, detailed as in a map. He went to and fro in it, feeding his terrors. He saw the hollies, the snowy borders, the paths where he had sought Alan, the high conventual walls, the shut door. What was the door shut? Aye, truly he had shut it, shut in his money, his escape, his future life, shut it with these hands, and none could now open it. He heard the snap of the spring lock, like something bursting in his brain, and sat astonished. And then he woke again, terror jarring through his vitals. This was no time to be idle. He must be up and doing, he must think. Once at the end of this ridiculous cruise, once at the lodge door, there would be nothing for it but to turn the cab and trundle back again. Why then go so far? Why add another feature of suspicion to a case already so suggestive? Why not turn at once? It was easy to say, turn, but whither? He had nowhere now to go to. He could never, he saw it in letters of blood, he could never pay that cab. He was saddled with that cab forever. Oh, that cab. His soul yearned and burned, and his bowels sounded to be rid of it. He forgot all other cares. He must first quit himself of this ill-smelling vehicle and of the human beast that guided it. First do that, at least, do that at once. And just then the cab suddenly stopped, and there was his persecutor rapping on the front glass. John let it down and beheld the port wine countenance inflamed with intellectual triumph. "I ken where ye are," cried the husky voice. "I mind ye now. Ye're a Nicholson. I drove ye to Hermiston to a Christmas party, and ye came back on the box, and I let ye drive. It is a fact." John knew the man, they had been even friends. His enemy, he now remembered, was a fellow of great good nature, endless good nature with a boy. Why not with a man? Why not appeal to his better side? He grasped at the new hope. "Great Scott, and so you did," he cried, as if in a transport of delight, his voice sounding false in his own ears. "Well, if that's so, I've something to say to you. I'll just get out, I guess. Where are we anyway?" The driver had fluttered his ticket in the eyes of the branch toll-keeper, and they were now brought to on the highest and most solitary part of the by-road. On the left, a row of fieldside trees beshaded it. On the right, it was bordered by naked fallows, undulating downhill to the Queensferry Road. In front, Corstorphine Hill raised its snow-bedabbled, darkling woods against the sky. John looked all about him, drinking the clear air like wine. Then his eyes returned to the cabman's face as he sat, not ungleefully, awaiting John's communication, with the air of one looking to be tipped. The features of that face were hard to read. Drink had so swollen them, drink had so painted them, in tints that varied from brick red to mulberry. The small grey eyes blinked. The lips moved, with greed. Greed was the ruling passion, and though there was some good nature, some genuine kindliness, a true human touch, in the old toper, his greed was now so set afire by hope that all other traits of character lay dormant. He sat there a monument of gluttonous desire. John's heart slowly fell. He had opened his lips, but he stood there and uttered naught. He sounded the well of his courage, and it was dry. He groped in his treasury of words, and it was vacant. The devil of dumbness had him by the throat. The devil of terror babbled in his ears, and suddenly, without a word uttered, with no conscious purpose formed in his will, John whipped about, tumbled over the roadside wall, and began running for his life across the fallows. He had not gone far, he was not past the midst of the first field, when his whole brain thundered within him. "Fool, you have your watch." The shock stopped him, and he faced once more toward the cab. The driver was leaning over the wall, brandishing his whip, his face empurpled, roaring like a bull, and John saw or thought that he had lost the chance. No watch would pacify the man's resentment now. He would cry for vengeance also. John would be had under the eye of the police, his tale would be unfolded, his secret plumbed, His destiny would close on him at last, and forever. He uttered a deep sigh, and just as the cabman, taking heart of grace, was beginning at last to scale the wall, his defaulting customer fell again to running, and disappeared into the further fields. Chapter 8. Singular instance of the utility of pass keys. Where he ran at first John never very clearly knew, nor yet how long a time elapsed ere he found himself in the by-road near the lodge of Ravelston, propped against the wall, his lungs heaving like bellows, his legs leaden heavy, his mind possessed by one sole desire to lie down and be unseen. He remembered the thick coverts round the quarry hole pond, an untrodden corner of the world where he might surely find concealment till the night should fall. Thither he passed down a lane, and when he came there, behold, he had forgotten the frost, and the pond was alive with young people skating, and the pondside coverts were thick with lookers-on. He looked on a while himself. There was one tall, graceful maiden, skating hand in hand with a youth, on whom she bestowed her bright eyes perhaps too patently, and it was strange with what anger John beheld her. He could have broken forth in curses, he could have stood there, like a mortified tramp, and shaken his fist and vented his gall upon her by the hour or so, he thought, and the next moment his heart bled for the girl. Poor creature, it's little she knows, he sighed. Let her enjoy herself while she can but, was it possible? When Flora used to smile at him on the Braid Ponds, she could have looked so fulsome to a sick-hearted bystander. The thought of one quarry, in his frozen wits, suggested another, and he plodded off toward Craiglith. A wind had sprung up out of the northwest. It was cruel keen. It dried him like a fire, and racked his finger joints. It brought clouds, too pale, swift, hurrying clouds, that blotted heaven and shed gloom upon the earth. He scrambled up among the hazelled rubbish heaps that surround the cauldron of the quarry, and lay flat upon the stones. The wind searched close along the earth. The stones were cutting and icy. The bare hazels wailed about him, and soon the air of the afternoon began to be vocal with those strange and dismal harpings that herald snow. Pain and misery turned in John's limbs to a harrowing impatience and blind desire of change. Now he would roll in his harsh lair, and when the flints abraded him, was almost pleased. Now he would crawl to the edge of the huge pit, and look dizzily down. He saw the spiral of the descending roadway, the steep crags, the clinging bushes, the peppering of snow wreaths, and far down in the bottom, the diminished crane. Here, no doubt, was a way to end it, but it somehow did not take his fancy. And suddenly he was aware that he was hungry. Even through the tortures of the cold, even through the frosts of despair, a gross, desperate longing after food, no matter what, no matter how, began to wake and spur him. Suppose he pawned his watch? But no, on Christmas Day, this was Christmas Day, the pawn shop would be closed. Suppose he went to the public house close by at Blackwell, and offered the watch, which was worth £10, in payment for a meal of bread and cheese. The incongruity was too remarkable. The good folks would either put him to the door, or only let him in to send for the police. He turned his pockets out one after another, some San Francisco tramcar checks, one cigar, no lights, the pass key to his father's house, a pocket handkerchief, with just a touch of scent. No, money could be raised on none of these. There was nothing for it but to starve. And after all, what mattered it? That also was a door of exit. He crept close among the bushes, the wind playing round him like a lash. His clothes seemed thin as paper, his joints burned, his skin curdled on his bones. He had a vision of a high-lying cattle drive in California, and the bed of a dried stream with one muddy pool, by which the vaqueros had encamped. Splendid sun over all, the big bonfire blazing, the strips of cow browning and smoking on a skewer of wood. How warm it was, how savoury the steam of scorching meat. And then again he remembered his manifold calamities, and burrowed and wallowed in the sense of his disgrace and shame. And next he was entering Frank's restaurant in Montgomery Street, San Francisco. He had ordered a pan stew and venison chops, of which he was immoderately fond. And as he sat waiting, Monroe, the good attendant, brought him a whiskey punch. He saw the strawberries float on the delectable cup. He heard the ice chink about the straws. And then he woke again to his detested fate, and found himself sitting, humped together, in a windy comb of quarry-refused darkness thick about him, thin flakes of snow flying here and there like rags of paper, and the strong shuddering of his body clashing his teeth like a hiccough. We have seen John in nothing but the stormiest condition. We have seen him reckless, desperate, tried beyond his moderate powers, of his daily self, cheerful, regular, not unthrifty. We have seen nothing. And it may thus be a surprise to the reader to learn that he was studiously careful of his health. This favourite preoccupation now awoke. If he were to sit there and die of cold, there would be mighty little gained. Better the police cell and the chances of a jury trial, than the miserable certainty of death at a dykeside before the next winter's dawn, or death a little later in the gas-lighted wards of an infirmary. He rose on aching legs, and stumbled here and there among the rubbish heaps, still circumvented by the yawning crater of the quarry. Or perhaps he only thought so, for the darkness was already dense, the snow was growing thicker, and he moved like a blind man, and with a blind man's terrors. At last he climbed a fence, thinking to drop into the road, and found himself staggering, instead, among the iron furrows of a ploughland, endless, it seemed, as a whole county. And next he was in a wood, beating among young trees, and then he was aware of a house with many lighted windows, Christmas carriages waiting at the doors. And Christmas drivers for Christmas has a double edge, becoming swiftly hooded with snow. From this glimpse of human cheerfulness, he fled like Cain, wandered in the night, unpiloted, careless of whither he went, fell and lay, and then rose again and wandered further. And at last, like a transformation scene, behold him in the lighted jaws of the city, staring at a lamp which had already donned the tilted nightcap of the snow. It came thickly now, a feeding storm, and while he yet stood blinking at the lamp, his feet were buried. He remembered something like it in the past, a street lamp crowned and caked upon the windward side with snow, the wind uttering its mournful hoot, himself looking on, even as now, but the cold had struck too sharply on his wits, and memory failed him as to the date and sequel of the reminiscence. His next conscious moment was on the Dean Bridge, but whether he was John Nicholson of a bank in a California street, or some former John, a clerk in his father's office, he had now clean forgotten. Another blank, and he was thrusting his pass key into the door lock of his father's house. Hours must have passed. Whether crouched on the cold stones or wandering in the fields among the snow was more than he could tell, but hours had passed. The finger of the hall clock was close on 12, a narrow peep of gas in the hall lamp shed shadows, and the door of the back room, his father's room, was open, and emitted a warm light. At so late an hour, all this was strange. The light should have been out, the doors locked, the good folks safe in bed. He marvelled at the irregularity, leaning on the hall table, and marvelled to himself there, and tored and grew once more hungry in the warmer air of the house. The clock uttered its premonitory catch. In 5 minutes Christmas Day would be among the days of the past Christmas. What a Christmas! Well, there was no use waiting. He had come into that house, he scarce knew how. If they were to thrust him forth again, it had best be done at once, and he moved to the door of the back room and entered. Oh, well, then he was insane, as he had long believed. There, in his father's room, at midnight the fire was roaring and the gas blazing. The papers, the sacred papers to lay a hand on which was criminal, had all been taken off and piled along the floor. A cloth was spread, and a supper laid upon the business table, and in his father's chair a woman, habited like a nun, sat eating. As he appeared in the doorway, the nun rose, gave a low cry, and stood staring. She was a large woman, strong, calm, a little masculine, her features marked with courage and good sense, and as John blinked back at her, a faint resemblance dodged about his memory, as when a tune haunts us, and yet will not be recalled. "Why, it's John," cried the nun. "I dare say I'm mad," said John, unconsciously following King Lear, "but upon my word, I do believe you're Flora." "Of course I am," replied she. "And yet it is not Flora at all," thought John. Flora was slender and timid, and of changing colour, and dewy-eyed, and had Flora such an Edinburgh accent. But he said none of these things, which was perhaps as well. What he said was, "Then why are you a nun?" "Such nonsense," said Flora. "I'm a sick nurse, and I am here nursing your sister, with whom, between you and me, there is precious little the matter. But that is not the question. The point is, how do you come here, and are you not ashamed to show yourself?" "Flora," said John, sepulchrally, "I haven't eaten anything for 3 days. Or at least I don't know what day it is, but I guess I'm starving." "You unhappy man," she cried. "Here, sit down and eat my supper, and I'll just run upstairs and see my patient, not but what I doubt she's fast asleep, for Maria is a malade imaginaire." With this specimen of the French, not of Stratford at Bow, but of a finishing establishment in Moray Place, she left John alone in his father's sanctum. He fell at once upon the food, and it is to be supposed that Flora had found her patient wakeful, and been detained with some details of nursing, for he had time to make a full end of all there was to eat, and not only to empty the teapot, but to fill it again from a kettle that was fitfully singing on his father's fire. Then he sat torpid, and pleased, and bewildered. His misfortunes were then half forgotten, his mind considering, not without regret, this unsentimental return to his old love. He was thus engaged, when that bustling woman noiselessly re-entered. "Have you eaten?" said she. "Then tell me all about it." It was a long and, as the reader knows, a pitiful story, but Flora heard it with compressed lips. She was lost in none of those questionings of human destiny that have, from time to time, arrested the flight of my own pen, for women, such as she, are no philosophers, and behold the concrete only. And women, such as she, are very hard on the imperfect man. "Very well," said she, when he had done. "Then down upon your knees at once, and beg God's forgiveness." And the great baby plumped upon his knees and did as he was bid, and none the worse for that. But while he was heartily enough requesting forgiveness on general principles, the rational side of him distinguished, and wondered if, perhaps, the apology were not due upon the other part. And when he rose again from that becoming exercise, he first eyed the face of his old love doubtfully, and then, taking heart uttered his protest. "I must say, Flora," said he, "in all this business I can see very little fault of mine." "If you had written home," replied the lady, "there would have been none of it. If you had even gone to Murrayfield reasonably sober, you would never have slept there, and the worst would not have happened. Besides, the whole thing began years ago. You got into trouble, and when your father, honest man, was disappointed, you took the pet, or got afraid, and ran away from punishment. Well, you've had your own way of it, John, and I don't suppose you like it. I sometimes fancy I'm not much better than a full-side John." "My dear John," said she, "not much." He looked at her, and his eye fell. A certain anger rose within him. Here was a Flora he disowned. She was hard, she was of a set colour, a settled, mature, undecorative manner, plain of speech, plain of habit. He had come near saying plain of face, and this changeling called herself by the same name as the many-coloured, clinging maid of yore, she of the frequent laughter, and the many sighs, and the kind, stolen glances. And to make all worse, she took the upper hand with him, which as John well knew was not the true relation of the sexes. He steeled his heart against this sick nurse. "And how do you come to be here?" he asked. She told him how she had nursed her father in his long illness, and when he died, and she was left alone, had taken to nurse others, partly from habit, partly to be of some service in the world, partly, it might be, for amusement. "There's no accounting for taste," said she, and she told him how she went largely to the houses of old friends, as the need arose, and how she was thus doubly welcome as an old friend first, and then as an experienced nurse, to whom doctors would confide the gravest cases. "And indeed it's a mere farce my being here for poor Maria," she continued, "but your father takes her ailments to heart, and I cannot always be refusing him. We are great friends, your father and I. He was very kind to me long ago, 10 years ago." A strange stir came in John's heart. All this while had he been thinking only of himself? All this while, why had he not written to Flora? In penitential tenderness he took her hand, and to his awe and trouble it remained in his, compliant. A voice told him this was Flora. After all, told him so quietly, yet with a thrill of singing. "And you never married?" said he. "No, John, I never married," she replied. The hall clock striking 2 recalled them to the sense of time. "And now," said she, "you have been fed and warmed, and I have heard your story, and now it's high time to call your brother." "Oh," cried John, chapfallen, "do you think that absolutely necessary?" "I can't keep you here, I am a stranger," said she. "Do you want to run away again? I thought you had enough of that." He bowed his head under the reproof. She despised him, he reflected, as he sat once more alone, a monstrous thing for a woman to despise a man. And strangest of all, she seemed to like him. Would his brother despise him too? And would his brother like him? And presently the brother appeared, under Flora's escort, and standing afar off beside the doorway, eyed the hero of this tale. "So this is you," he said, at length. "Yes, Alec. It's me, it's John," replied the elder brother feebly. "And how did you get in here?" inquired the younger. "Oh, I had my pass key," says John. "The deuce you had," said Alexander. "Ah, you lived in a better world. There are no pass keys going now." "Well, father was always averse to them," sighed John, and the conversation then broke down, and the brothers looked askance at one another in silence. "Well, and what the devil are we to do?" said Alexander. "I suppose if the authorities got wind of you, you would be taken up." "It depends on whether they've found the body or not," returned John, "and then there's that cabman, to be sure." "Oh, bother the body," said Alexander. "I mean about the other thing. That's serious." "Is that what my father spoke about?" asked John. "The first don't even know what it is." "About your robbing your bank in California, of course," replied Alexander. It was plain, from Flora's face, that this was the first she had heard of it. It was plainer still, from John's, that he was innocent. "Aye," he exclaimed. "I robbed my bank. My God, Flora, this is too much. Even you must allow that." "Meaning you didn't?" asked Alexander. "I never robbed a soul in all my days," cried John, "except my father, if you call that robbery. And I brought him back the money in this room, and he wouldn't even take it." "Look here," John said his brother, "let us have no misunderstanding upon this. Maswen saw my father. He told him a bank you had worked for in San Francisco was wiring over the habitable globe to have you collared, that it was supposed you had nailed thousands, and it was dead certain you had nailed 300. So Maswen said, and I wish you would be careful how you answer. I may tell you also that your father paid the 300 on the spot." 300, repeated John. £300, you mean? That's $1,500. "Why then, it's Kirkman," he broke out. "Thank heaven. I can explain all that. I gave them to Kirkman to pay for me the night before I left, $1,500, and a letter to the manager. What do they suppose I would steal $1,500 for? I'm rich. I struck it rich in stocks. It's the silliest stuff I ever heard of. All that's needful is to cable to the manager. Kirkman has the 1500 fine. Kirkman. He was a fellow clerk of mine, and a hard case, but to do him justice, I didn't think he was as hard as this. And what do you say to that? Alec asked Flora. I say the cablegram shall go tonight, cried Alexander with energy. Answer prepaid too. If this can be cleared away, and upon my word I do believe it can, we shall all be able to hold up our heads again. Here you, John. You stick down the address of your bank manager. You, Flora, you can pack John into my bed, for which I have no further use tonight. As for me, I am off to the post office, and thence to the high street about the dead body. The police ought to know, you see, and they ought to know through John. And I can tell them some rigmarole about my brother being a man of highly nervous organization, and the rest of it. And then I'll tell you what, John, did you notice the name upon the cab? John gave the name of the driver, which, as I have not been able to command the vehicle, I here suppress. Well, resumed Alexander, I'll call round at their place before I come back, and pay your shot for you. In that way, before breakfast time, you'll be as good as new. John murmured inarticulate thanks. To see his brother thus energetic in his service moved him beyond expression. If he could not utter what he felt, he showed it legibly in his face, and Alexander read it there, and liked it the better in that dumb delivery. But there's one thing, said the latter, cablegrams are dear, and I dare say you remember enough of the governor to guess the state of my finances. The trouble is, said John, that all my stamps are in that beastly house. All you what? Asked Alexander. Stamps money, explained John. It's an American expression. I'm afraid I contracted one or two. I have some, said Flora. I have a pound note upstairs. My dear Flora, returned Alexander, a pound note won't see us very far. And besides, this is my father's business, and I shall be very much surprised if it isn't my father who pays for it. I would not apply to him yet. I do not think that can be wise, objected Flora. You have a very imperfect idea of my resources, and not at all of my effrontery, replied Alexander. Please observe. He put John from his way, chose a stout knife among the supper things, and with surprising quickness broke into his father's drawer. There's nothing easier when you come to try, he observed, pocketing the money. I wish you had not done that, said Flora. You will never hear the last of it. Oh! I don't know, returned the young man. The governor is human after all. And now, John, let me see your famous pass key. Get into bed, and don't move for anyone till I come back. They won't mind you not answering when they knock. I generally don't myself. Chapter 9, in which Mr. Nicholson accepts the principle of an allowance. In spite of the horrors of the day and the tea-drinking of the night, John slept the sleep of infancy. He was awakened by the maid, as it might have been 10 years ago, tapping at the door. The winter sunrise was painting the east, and as the window was to the back of the house, it shone into the room with many strange colors of refracted light. Without, the houses were all cleanly roofed with snow. The garden walls were coped with it a foot in height. The greens lay glittering. Yet strange as snow had grown to John during his years upon the Bay of San Francisco, it was what he saw within that most affected him, for it was to his own room that Alexander had been promoted. There was the old paper with the device of flowers, in which a cunning fancy might yet detect the face of Skinny Jim. Of the academy, John's former dominie, there was the old chest of drawers. There were the chairs 1, 2, 3 as before. Only the carpet was new, and the litter of Alexander's clothes and books and drawing materials, and a pencil drawing on the wall, which in John's eyes appeared a marvel of proficiency. He was thus lying and looking, and dreaming, hanging as it were between two epochs of his life, when Alexander came to the door and made his presence known in a loud whisper. John let him in, and jumped back into the warm bed. Well, John, said Alexander, the cablegram is sent in your name and 20 words of answer paid. I have been to the cab office and paid your cab, even saw the old gentleman himself, and properly apologized. He was mighty placable, and indicated his belief you had been drinking. Then I knocked up old Maswin out of bed, and explained affairs to him as he sat and shivered in a dressing gown. And before that I had been to the High Street, where they have heard nothing of your dead body, so that I inclined to the idea that you dreamed it. Catch me, said John. Well, the police never do know anything, assented Alexander, and at any rate they have dispatched a man to inquire and to recover your trousers and your money, so that really your bill is now fairly clean, and I see but one lion in your path, the governor. I'll be turned out again. You'll see, said John, dismally. I don't imagine so, returned the other, not if you do what Flora and I have arranged, and your business now is to dress, and lose no time about it. Is your watch right? Well, you have a quarter of an hour. By 5 minutes before the half hour you must be at table, in your old seat, under Uncle Duthie's picture. Flora will be there to keep you countenance, and we shall see what we shall see. Now, wouldn't it be wiser for me to stay in bed, said John. If you mean to manage your own concerns, you can do precisely what you like, replied Alexander. But if you are not in your place 5 minutes before the half hour, I wash my hands of you, for one. And thereupon he departed. He had spoken warmly, but the truth is, his heart was somewhat troubled, and as he hung over the balusters, watching for his father to appear, he had hard ado to keep himself braced for the encounter that must follow. If he takes it well, I shall be lucky, he reflected. If he takes it ill, why, it'll be a herring across John's tracks, and perhaps all for the best. He's a confounded muff, this brother of mine, but he seems a decent soul. At that stage a door opened below with a certain emphasis, and Mr. Nicholson was seen solemnly to descend the stairs and pass into his own apartment. Alexander followed, quaking inwardly, but with a steady face. He knocked, was bidden to enter, and found his father standing in front of the forced drawer, to which he pointed as he spoke. "This is a most extraordinary thing," said he. "I have been robbed." "I was afraid you would notice it," observed his son. "It made such a beastly hash of the table." "You were afraid I would notice it," repeated Mr. Nicholson. "And pray, what may that mean?" "That I was a thief, sir," returned Alexander. "I took all the money in case the servants should get hold of it, and here is the change, and a note of my expenditure. You were gone to bed, you see, and I did not feel at liberty to knock you up. But I think when you have heard the circumstances, you will do me justice. The fact is, I have reason to believe there has been some dreadful error about my brother John. The sooner it can be cleared up, the better for all parties. It was a piece of business, sir, and so I took it, and decided, on my own responsibility, to send a telegram to San Francisco. Thanks to my quickness, we may hear tonight. There appears to be no doubt, sir, that John has been abominably used." "When did this take place?" asked the father. "Last night, sir, after you were asleep," was the reply. "It's most extraordinary," said Mr. Nicholson. "Do you mean to say you have been out all night?" "All night, as you say, sir. I have been to the telegraph and the police office, and Mr. Massuin's." "Oh, I had my hands full," said Alexander. "Very irregular," said the father. "You think of no one but yourself." "I do not see that I have much to gain in bringing back my elder brother," returned Alexander, shrewdly. The answer pleased the old man. He smiled. Well, I will go into this after breakfast," said he. "I'm sorry about the table," said the son. "The table is a small matter." "I think nothing of that," said the father. "It's another example," continued the son, "of the awkwardness of a man having no money of his own. If I had a proper allowance, like other fellows of my age, this would have been quite unnecessary." "A proper allowance," repeated his father, in tones of blighting sarcasm, for the expression was not new to him. "I have never grudged you money for any proper purpose." No doubt," said Alexander, "but then you see you aren't always on the spot to have the thing explained to you. Last night, for instance." "You could have wakened me last night," interrupted his father. "Was it not some similar affair that first got John into a mess?" asked the son, skillfully evading the point. But the father was not less adroit. "And pray, sir, how did you come and go out of the house?" he asked. "I forgot to lock the door, it seems," replied Alexander. "I've had cause to complain of that too often," said Mr. Nicholson. "But still I do not understand. Did you keep the servants up?" "I propose to go into all that at length after breakfast," returned Alexander. "There is the half-hour going. We must not keep Miss Mackenzie waiting." And greatly daring, he opened the door. Even Alexander, who, it must have been perceived, was on terms of comparative freedom with his parent, even Alexander had never before dared to cut short an interview in this high-handed fashion. But the truth is, the very mass of his son's delinquencies daunted the old gentleman. He was like the man with the cart of apples. This was beyond him. That Alexander should have spoiled his table, taken his money, stayed out all night, and then coolly acknowledged all, was something undreamed of in the Nicholsonian philosophy, and transcended comment. The return of the change, which the old gentleman still carried in his hand, had been a feature of imposing impudence. It had dealt him a staggering blow. Then there was the reference to John's original flight of subject, which he always kept resolutely curtained in his own mind, for he was a man who loved to have made no mistakes. And when he feared he might have made one, kept the papers sealed. In view of all these surprises and reminders, and of his son's composed and masterful demeanor, there began to creep on Mr. Nicholson a clear misgiving. He seemed beyond his depth. If he did or said anything, he might come to regret it. The young man, besides, as he had pointed out himself, was playing a generous part, and if wrong had been done, and done to one who was, after, and in spite of, all a Nicholson, it should certainly be righted. All things considered, monstrous as it was to be cut short in his inquiries, the old gentleman submitted, pocketed the change, and followed his son into the dining-room. During these few steps he once more mentally revolted, and once more, and this time finally, laid down his arms, a still, small voice in his bosom having informed him authentically of a piece of news, that he was afraid of Alexander. The strange thing was that he was pleased to be afraid of him. He was proud of his son. He might be proud of him. The boy had character and grit, and knew what he was doing. These were his reflections as he turned the corner of the dining-room door. Miss Mackenzie was in the place of honor, conjuring with a teapot and a cozy, and, behold, there was another person present, a large, portly, whiskered man of a very comfortable and respectable air, who now rose from his seat and came forward, holding out his hand. "Good morning, father," said he. Of the contention of feeling that ran high in Mr. Nicholson's starched bosom, no outward sign was visible, nor did he delay long to make a choice of conduct. Yet in that interval he had reviewed a great field of possibilities, both past and future. Whether it was possible he had not been perfectly wise in his treatment of John, whether it was possible that John was innocent, whether if he turned John out a second time, as his outraged authority suggested, it was possible to avoid a scandal, and whether, if he went to that extremity, it was possible that Alexander might rebel. "Hum," said Mr. Nicholson, and put his hand, limp and dead, into John's. And then, in an embarrassed silence, all took their places, and even the paper from which it was the old gentleman's habit to suck mortification daily. As he marked the decline of our institutions, even the paper lay furled by his side. But presently Flora came to the rescue. She slid into the silence with a technicality, asking if John still took his old inordinate amount of sugar. Thence it was but a step to the burning question of the day, and in tones a little shaken, she commented on the interval since she had last made tea for the prodigal, and congratulated him on his return. And then, addressing Mr. Nicholson, she congratulated him also in a manner that defied his ill humour, and from that launched into the tale of John's misadventures, not without some suitable suppressions. Gradually Alexander joined between them. Whether he would or no, they forced a word or two from John, and these fell so tremulously, and spoke so eloquently of a mind oppressed with dread, that Mr. Nicholson relented. At length even he contributed a question, and before the meal was at an end all four were talking even freely. Prayers followed, with the servants gaping at this newcomer, whom no one had admitted, and after prayers there came that moment on the clock which was the signal for Mr. Nicholson's departure. "John," said he, "of course you will stay here. Be very careful not to excite Maria. If Miss Mackenzie thinks it desirable that you should see her. Alexander, I wish to speak with you alone," and then, when they were both in the back room, "You need not come to the office today," said he. "You can stay and amuse your brother, and I think it would be respectful to call on Uncle Gregg, and by the by this spoken with a certain, dare we say, bashfulness, I agree to concede the principle of an allowance, and I will consult with Dr. Dury, who is quite a man of the world and has sons of his own, as to the amount. And my fine fellow, you may consider yourself in luck," he added, with a smile. "Thank you," said Alexander. Before noon a detective had restored to John his money, and brought news, sad enough in truth, but perhaps the least sad possible. Alan had been found in his own house in Regent Terrace, under care of the terrified butler. He was quite mad, and instead of going to prison, had gone to Morningside Asylum. The murdered man, it appeared, was an evicted tenant who had for nearly a year pursued his late landlord with threats and insults, and beyond this, the cause and details of the tragedy were lost. When Mr. Nicholson returned from dinner, they were able to put a dispatch into his hands. John the 5th Nicholson, Randolph Crescent, Edinburgh. Kirkham has disappeared. Police looking for him. All understood. Keep mine quite easy. Austin having had this explained to him. The old gentleman took down the cellar key and departed for 2 bottles of the 1820 port. Uncle Gregg dined there that day, and Cousin Robina, and by an odd chance Mr. Macewen, and the presence of these strangers relieved what might have been otherwise a somewhat strained relation. Ere they departed, the family was welded once more into a fair semblance of unity. In the end of April John led Flora, or, as more descriptive, Flora led John to the altar, if altar that may be called, which was indeed the drawing-room mantelpiece in Mr. Nicholson's house, with the Reverend Dr. Dury posted on the hearthrug in the guise of Hymen's priest. The last I saw of them, on a recent visit to the north, was at a dinner party in the house of my old friend Gellatley McBride, and after we had, in classic phrase, rejoined the ladies, I had an opportunity to overhear Flora conversing with another married woman on the much-canvassed matter of a husband's tobacco. "Oh yes," said she. "I only allow Mr. Nicholson 4 cigars a day. 3 he smokes at fixed times after a meal, you know, my dear, and the 4th he can take when he likes with any friend." Bravo, thought I to myself. This is the wife of my friend John.